On the fourth day of a vacation I paid for, my daughter's future mother-in-law sat 11 feet from me at a swim-up bar in Cabo San Lucas and explained to her son how they were going to get my daughter pregnant. Not whether, when. She said it in Spanish, because these people had spent 11 years in Guadalajara before they came to Texas, and Spanish is what they use when they want privacy. I spent 6 years as a contract interpreter for the federal government. Spanish, Portuguese, and enough French to embarrass myself. 2 of those years I lived in Monterrey. I understood every word. If somebody has ever said something in front of you, they would never have said to you, "Stay with me. Subscribe before you go any further." I put one of these up every day. Hit like on your way past. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from. My name is Calvin Rutherford, and I am 58 years old. I grew up on the east side of Cleveland, in a house on East 128th with my grandmother and 2 cousins, and I did not have a father in the building. I was good at exactly one thing as a kid, and it was not sports, and it was not math. I could hear a language and hold on to it. My grandmother's neighbor was Puerto Rican, and I was fluent by 14 because I was in that kitchen every day after school eating her food. That is the whole origin. A woman named Ondina Fuentes who made rice and did not mind a boy who asked questions. I did 4 years in the army as a linguist, which is where they teach you properly and where they find out how far you can go, and then I did 6 years as a contract interpreter for a federal agency I am not going to name. Court work, trade delegations, 2 years in Monterrey and 11 months in Sao Paulo. That job taught me the thing that has run my whole life since. People will say anything in front of you if they have decided you cannot understand them. Anything. Things they would not say to a wall. I have sat in rooms as the interpreter and watched men negotiate against each other while insulting each other's mothers through me, with a smile on, and both of them assuming I was a machine that did not have a face. You learn what people actually are. And you learn to keep your face very still. I started Rutherford Freight Solutions in 1999 in a rented room in Garland, Texas, with a fax machine and $11,000. Specialty logistics, time critical, temperature controlled, high value. If you need something across the country in 19 hours and it cannot be above 4 degrees and it costs more than a house, somebody calls us. 26 years, 190 employees. We did about 61 million in revenue last year. My wife is named Sabine, and I met her in Monterrey in 1994 when she was working for a bank there, and I was translating for a delegation that had nothing to do with her, and she has told the story of how we met at approximately 400 parties, and it gets better every single time. Her Spanish is not mine. She is functional. She was in that country 3 years, and she can order food and argue with a landlord, and follow about 60% of a fast conversation between 2 native speakers. That 60% is going to matter. We have one daughter, Marisol Rutherford, 31 years old. She has been the chief executive of my company since she was 29 and RIMS. There is a version of how that happened that people assume, so here is the real one. She did not get handed anything. She worked 4 summers in our dock operation in Garland, starting at 16, on nights, on the same clock as everybody else. She went to Texas A&M for supply chain, and then she went and worked 3 years for a competitor in Memphis, and she did that on purpose, and I did not like it. She came back at 26 as a director. She ran the Southeast for 2 years and grew at 41%. At 29, the board, an actual board, 5 people, 3 of them outside directors, voted her in as chief executive, and one of the outside directors called me the night before to tell me he was voting yes, and that it was not a favor to me. I moved to executive chairman. I have a seat and a vote and an office I use about 3 days a week, and I do not run that company anymore, and that was the entire point. She met Tobias Hallstrom in 2022. His people are from Guadalajara. Not Mexican, Swedish on the father's side, and his mother Renata is from a family that has been in Jalisco for 4 generations without ever quite being from there, if you understand what I am saying. 11 years in Guadalajara, then Houston in 2014 when Bertil Hallstrom took a position with a chemical company. They are white, my family is not. That matters in about 11 minutes, and I am going to tell it exactly the way it happened and let you decide what it means. Marisol brought Tobias to the house in the fall of 2022. I liked him. I have said that sentence out loud maybe 40 times in the last year, and I am going to keep saying it, because the version where I saw through him immediately is a lie, and it makes me look better than I was. He was 32. He was easy. He asked my wife about her garden, and then asked a follow-up question about the garden, which is a thing almost nobody does. He shook my hand and looked at me while he did it. He had a marketing degree and a work history that was a lot of 18-month stops, and he was open about that, which I respected at the time and understand differently now. Bertil and Renata came to dinner at our house in January of 2023. Everything that happened later was already in that room that night, and I could not see it. Bertil is 64, and he is a large, quiet man who laughs at the right times. He is not the problem, and that gets complicated later. Renata is 59, and she is one of the most charming people I have ever been in a room with, and I mean that as a description of a skill. She walked into my house in Highland Park, and she was warm, and she was funny, and she complimented 4 specific things, and at some point in the first hour she said, "And Calvin, this house, did you build it or did you buy it?" I said, "We bought it in 2011. And she said, "Oh, of course." And then she said, "We looked in this neighborhood, but Bertil is old-fashioned about certain things." I did not understand that sentence in January of 2023. I understand it now. They got engaged in April of last year. He asked me first, which I appreciated, and he did it in my kitchen, and he was nervous, and it was not performed. And I have been over that 4-minute conversation about 200 times, looking for the seam, and I cannot find one. I do not think he was lying to me in that kitchen. I think that is the worst part. Marisol asked me for one thing after the engagement, and I said yes without thinking about it for more than about 90 seconds, and it is the single worst decision of my professional life. She asked me to bring Tobias into the company. He had been let go from a marketing position in November and had been looking for 5 months, and she said something about how it would be good for him to be somewhere he was valued, and she said it in the voice she has used on me since she was 6. I said yes. We put him in vendor relations. That is a real department, and it has 4 people in it, and it manages our third-party service providers, the outfits that do our packaging, our crating, our equipment servicing, our specialty containers. It is not a powerful job. It has no direct reports and no budget authority above a threshold. Above a threshold. He started in June of last year at $91,000 a year, and he was, by every account I got, fine. Not exceptional, fine. He showed up, he answered emails, people liked him. There was one afternoon in the fall that I have gone back to since. I stopped by vendor relations for something else entirely, and Tobias was at his desk, and he asked me a question about our crating spend, and it was a good question. Specific, he wanted to know why we were sourcing containment crates regionally instead of consolidating. I gave him a 15-minute answer, and I enjoyed giving it, because it is a genuinely interesting problem, and almost nobody asks about it. He was taking notes. I walked out of that department thinking, well, look at that, he is engaged with it. He registered Corvallis Container Services 11 weeks before that conversation. He was not asking me how the business worked. He was asking me where the seams were, and I stood there and drew him a map because a young man had shown an interest in what I do. The wedding got set for this coming October, and that is when I started to notice the thing about the money. Renata Hellstrom never contributed $1 to that wedding. Not a dollar. Not an offer, not a gesture, not a conversation about it. And Marisol and I did not care about that, because we can pay for a wedding and they cannot, and there is nothing shameful about that in either direction. What was strange was not that she did not pay, it was that she kept ordering. The venue was a ranch property outside Dripping Springs, and Marisol picked it, and it was already expensive. Renata went to see it in September and came back with a list. She wanted the ceremony moved to a different part of the property that required a tent and a generator. $41,000. She wanted a raw bar. In October, in Texas. She wanted the flowers changed to garden roses flown in from Ecuador, because the local grower Marisol had picked was, in her words, a bit rustic. She wanted the band replaced with a 9-piece out of Chicago. She had the number of a booking agent already. And in February, 3 weeks before the deposit deadline on the plated dinner, she added 11 guests. 11. 3 weeks before the deadline. At $240 a head plus service. Every time, she used the same word. Obviously, we will want the tent. Obviously, the flowers. Obviously, we cannot have people standing around with nothing to eat. Obviously. And every single time, I paid it. And I said thank you for helping, because she had made a phone call, and I had written a check. and in her framing, those were the same contribution. By March, I had put $181,000 into that wedding. I did not resent it, and I did not resent $1 of it at the time. That is my only child. What bothered me, in a small way I could not name, was the ease of it. There is a specific way a person spends other people's money, and it is different from the way they spend their own. And I have sat across from 1,000 negotiators, and I know the difference in my sleep. She was not spending my money like a guest. She was spending it like an owner. I did not have a word for that in March. I had one by May. The vacation was my idea, and I have to own that. 10 days in Cabo San Lucas. A rented villa on the Pacific side with a pool and a cook who came in the mornings. 6 of us. Me, Sabine, Marisol, Tobias, Bertil, and Renata. And I paid for every bit of it, flights included. The reasoning was simple, and I still think it was sound. Our families were about to be permanently connected and had spent maybe 11 hours in the same room in 2.5 years. I wanted us to know each other before there was a wedding rather than after. I booked it in February for the first week of May. Renata upgraded the villa. Of course she did. She found one with a better view and sent me the link and said, obviously this one is better for $9,000 more. I said fine. Now here is the piece of it that nobody knew, including my daughter. Marisol has known her whole life that I speak Spanish, obviously. She has heard me on the phone with our Monterrey people for 20 years. She had never once mentioned it to Tobias. Not out of any strategy. She simply never thought about it, in the way that you never think to tell your fiancé that your father has a particular scar or knows how to weld. It had not come up, and Tobias had never asked, because why would he? She told me later that she had been planning to bring it up on the trip, as a nice thing. A surprise for Renata. See, Dad speaks Spanish. Isn't that wonderful? Now we can all talk. She was going to do it at the first dinner. She got distracted by something with the luggage and it went out of her head. That is the whole thing. That is the hinge that everything else in my life now hangs on. A piece of luggage in an airport in Cabo San Lucas, and a 31-year-old woman with 4 things on her mind. There is one more thing about that villa, and I noticed it on the first afternoon, and did not think about it again for 3 weeks. Renata picked the rooms. She did it in about 40 seconds while everybody was still carrying bags in. She walked through the whole place ahead of the rest of us, and by the time I came in with the last of it, she was saying, we will take this one, and Tobias and Marisol should have the one at the end because of the light, and Calvin, you and Sabine will love the one upstairs. The one upstairs was the furthest from everything, 2 floors up, at the back, over the garage. I said, that sounds great. I have thought about those 40 seconds a great deal since. I do not believe she planned it. I believe a woman walked into a house and arranged, without being conscious of it, for the man she was going to be talking about to be as far from the conversation as the building allowed. That is not a scheme. That is an instinct, and instincts tell you more about a person than schemes do. The first night, we ate on the terrace and it was good. It was actually good, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. Bertil and I talked about fishing, which I do not do, and he was patient about explaining it. Renata told a long story about a market in Guadalajara that was genuinely funny. Marisol was happy, and Tobias had his arm on the back of her chair. We went to bed at about 11, and I remember thinking that this had been a good idea. The second day, I heard the first thing. It was late afternoon, and I had come up from the beach, and I was in the kitchen getting water, and Renata and Tobias were on the terrace, about 15 feet away with the door open. They did not hear me come in. There is a tile floor, and I was barefoot. And Renata said, in Spanish, I am going to give it to you in English, but understand that every one of these words was in Spanish. She said, has she said anything about the shares? And Tobias said, no, and it is not the right time. And she said, there is not going to be a right time. You are going to have to make one. Then she said something I did not catch because the refrigerator compressor kicked on, and then she said, clearly, the way you say a thing you have said before. She said, he is going to leave it to her, and she is going to leave it to a lawyer if you do not move. I stood in that kitchen with a glass in my hand, and then I walked out onto that terrace with the water like a man who had heard nothing, and I said something about the beach, and I watched both of them go completely still for about 1.5 seconds. Renata's eyes went to me and did that thing, that fast recalculation. Was he in there? How long? And I said, is there more of that mango left, or did we finish it? And she laughed, a little too fast, and said she thought there was some in the kitchen. I said great, and I walked back in. I stood at that counter for probably 90 seconds not moving, because I had a decision to make right there, and I had about a minute to make it. I could go get my daughter, I could bring her out onto that terrace, and tell her what I had just heard, and she would ask them, and they would say I misunderstood, that my Spanish was rusty, that it was about something else entirely. And she would want to believe them, not because she is weak, because she was 4 months from a wedding, and it is very expensive to believe your father over the man you are marrying. Or I could say nothing. I have been in about 4,000 rooms where I was the only person who knew what was actually being said, and I have never once used it, and I have thought a great deal about why I did not walk out onto that terrace. The honest answer is that 90 seconds was not enough information. I did not know what shares meant. I did not know what move meant. I had one conversation with a compressor running through the middle of it, and if I had spent that ammunition on the second day of a 10-day trip, I would have had nothing. So I put the mango in a bowl, and I carried it outside, and I sat down with those people, and I ate fruit. That night I told Sabine. I told her in our room with the door shut and the shower running, which I understand sounds dramatic, and which was simply what I did. And my wife of 29 years listened to the whole thing and then said, "Calvin, are you sure?" I said I was sure. She said, "Are you sure it was shares? Because it could have been." And I said, "Sabine, I did that for 6 years." She sat down on the end of the bed. And then she said the thing that told me she had been carrying something too. She said quietly, I thought I was being ridiculous. I said, "About what?" And she said, "In November, at that dinner at Marisol's, Renata asked me who owns the building in Garland." I said, "She what?" Sabine said, "She asked whether the company owns the building or whether you own it personally," and I said I did not know off the top of my head, which was true, and she said it was just curiosity because Bertel is interested in that kind of thing. November, 6 months before Cabo. 29 years of marriage and neither one of us had said anything to the other, because both of us had decided we were being unfair to a woman who had been nothing but warm to our faces. Then Sabine said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to know everything." We made a decision in that room and we made it in about 4 minutes, and it is the reason I have a company and my daughter has a life. I said, "Do not tell Marisol." And Sabine said, "Calvin, she has to know." I said, "She has to know when I can prove it." Right now I have a sentence I heard through a refrigerator. Then I said the other part, which is the part that mattered. I said, "And she is going to tell them, not on purpose. She has been planning to tell them I speak Spanish since we got here." Sabine's face changed. She said, "Oh no." I said, "Yes." We had to spend the next 8 days managing our own daughter away from the one piece of information that would have ended everything. The next morning, I asked Marisol to go with me to get coffee. We drove into town, just the two of us, and I did the hardest piece of acting I have ever done in my life on a road on the Pacific side of Baja California, with my kid in the passenger seat. I said, "Hey, do me a favor this week." She said, "What?" I said, "Do not tell them I speak Spanish." She turned and looked at me, and I said, "And this is a lie, and it is the only lie I told my daughter in this entire thing, and I have not fully put it down." I said, "I want to see how much I can still follow. Renata talks fast. It has been years. Let me use the week." Marisol laughed at me. She said, "Dad, that is so weird." I said, "Humor your father." And she said, "Fine. Okay. But you have to tell them at the end, because Renata is going to be so excited." I said, "I will tell them at the end." That is the only true thing in that entire conversation, and I did not know it at the time. I started recording on the 4th day. I did not go on that vacation with a plan to record anybody. I did not think of it until the 3rd night, lying awake, and what I thought was that I was going to hear something enormous, and then be a 58-year-old man telling his daughter a story about what he had heard. I have a phone. Everybody has a phone. There is a voice memo application on it that has been there since I bought it, and that I had used 4 times. So for the next 6 days, I put my phone face down on tables. That is the entire technique. There is nothing sophisticated about it. A phone face down next to a bowl of limes, while a man goes and gets in the pool. Most of it is unusable. People imagine some clean surveillance product, and what I actually got was about 11 hours of wind, a blender, ice in glasses, and a Mexican radio station. What came out of 11 hours was about 9 minutes. 9 minutes is enough. 9 minutes is far more than enough. The fourth day is the one I will be hearing when I am 80. We were at the swim-up bar at about 4 in the afternoon. Bertil was asleep in a chair under an umbrella. Marisol and Sabine had gone into town to look at something and had been gone 2 hours. Tobias and Renata were in the water at the bar, and I was maybe 11 feet away on a lounger, with a towel over my legs and a paperback I was not reading, and my phone was on the little table beside me with a hat next to it. They had been talking for a while about nothing, the flight, a restaurant. Then Renata said, "So what did the accountant say about the trust structure?" And Tobias said something I could not hear because a blender ran. And then she said this, and it is on that recording, and it has been read out loud by a certified translator in a document with a stamp on it, and I am giving it to you word for word. She said, "Listen to me. Nothing happens while she is running that company. Nothing. You need her to want something else." He said, "She is not going to want something else. She loves that job." And Renata Hallstrom said, "She is 31 years old." Then she said, "Get her pregnant." He did not say anything for a second. And she said, "I am serious. Get her pregnant this year. And by the time that child is 1, she will be looking at that schedule, and she will be the one asking for a change, and you will be there." She said, "And Calvin will hand it to you himself, and he will think it was his idea, because he is not going to let a stranger run it, and there will not be anybody else." Tobias said, and this is the part I have not been able to put down, he said, "She wants kids anyway." And his mother said, "Then there is no problem." Then she said something about how she was going to get out of the sun, and she got out of the pool. I was 11 feet away with a towel over my legs and a paperback in my hands. Something happened in my body that has never happened before or since. Nothing happened. That is the thing. I did not get hot. My hands did not shake. I have been in some situations in my life, and I know what adrenaline does, and this was not that. What I felt was a kind of enormous quiet, like the noise on a job site when a compressor shuts off, and you did not know it was loud until it stopped. I sat on that lounger and turned a page of a book I was not reading, and I thought, in a completely level voice inside my own head, they are talking about scheduling my grandchild. Not having one, scheduling one, as an instrument. Renata walked past me on the way to her chair, and she said, "Calvin, you are going to burn." And I said, "You are probably right." And she said, "Put something on," and went and sat down with her magazine. Let me stop for 1 second because we are coming up on the part I have never laid out for anybody in one piece. If you are still here, do me a favor, subscribe. I put a new one of these up every single day. Hit the like button on your way past. And tell me this in the comments because I have never resolved it. I sat 11 feet away and heard a woman plan my daughter's pregnancy as a business strategy, and I said, "You are probably right. About sunscreen. Should I have stood up?" I read all of them. Over the next 5 days, I got the rest of it, in pieces, and the pieces are worse than the strategy. Because here is what nobody tells you about listening to people who do not know you can hear them. It is not one conversation. It never is. The plan is maybe 4% of what comes out of a person's mouth in 8 days. The other 96% is who they are. And the 96% is what I could not stop hearing after I got home. On day 4, an hour after the bar, Renata was on the phone with somebody in Houston, and I walked past an open window. She said, in Spanish, "No, they are lovely. They are very generous." Then she laughed and said, "It is a lot of house for 2 people. That is all. It is nothing." Any person might say it. I sat down on a step outside that window and did not get up for a while, because it was the first thing I had heard that was not a plan and was not cruelty, and it was somehow worse than either one, because it was casual. That is what she is like when nothing is at stake. On day 5, at dinner, when Marisol had gone inside to take a call, Renata said to Bertil in Spanish that she could not believe how much this trip must have cost, and that it was fortunate that these people apparently could not think of anything better to do with it. These people, esta gente. Not the Rutherfords, not Calvin, these people. Bertil did not answer her. That matters later. He looked at his plate and did not answer, and I have thought about that man's silence a great deal since. On day 6, by the pool, Tobias asked his mother what she thought of the house in Highland Park. And she said it was very nice, and then she said, in Spanish, obviously somebody helped them get in there. He said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "There are programs. Do not be naive. I bought that house in 2011, with a wire transfer. On day 7, and this is the one my wife heard and I did not, because I was in the water and Sabine was in a chair with her eyes closed and everybody had forgotten she was there. Renata was talking about Marisol running the company. And she said, in Spanish, "How do they think a man is supposed to work under his own wife?" And then she said, "And she is not." And she stopped. She did not finish it. Sabine has told me 4 times and she has never varied. "Y ella ni siquiera es." And she stopped. And then she said something else entirely about the menu. My wife lay in that chair with her eyes shut and did not move a muscle. Sabine did not come find me for 4 hours after that. She lay in that chair for another 20 minutes with her eyes closed, because she could not work out how to get up without it looking like she was getting up. Then she went and swam. Then she read a book she was not reading, which is a thing we had both been doing for days without knowing the other one was doing it. She came and found me that night, and she was not the same woman who had asked me on day 2 whether I was sure. She said, "Calvin." And I said, "What?" And she said, "I heard it." Then she said, "I did not want you to be right." That is the whole marriage in one sentence. I did not want you to be right. Then she sat down on the bed and said, "What is the rest of it?" And I told her the bar. Day 4, all of it. My wife has a very particular way of receiving bad information that I have watched for 29 years, which is that she gets slower rather than faster. She asked me 3 questions, in order, with pauses between them. She asked whether I was certain about the word for pregnant, which is a fair question, and I said yes. She asked whether he had argued. I said, he said she wants kids anyway. And Sabine Rutherford, who has never raised her voice at me in 29 years, said a word in Spanish about that boy that I am not going to repeat on this channel. On day 8, I almost lost it, and not in the way you think. We were at breakfast and Renata said something to Tobias about the car and I laughed, out loud, half a second before anybody else could have, because there was nothing in English to laugh at. 4 people looked at me, and I did the only thing available, which was to hold up my phone and say, "Sorry, Purcell just sent me something." Purcell Adeyemi runs my southeast region, and he had not sent me anything. Marisol said, "At breakfast, what did he send you?" And I said, "It is a work thing," and I put the phone down. Tobias was looking at me, not suspiciously, just looking, the way you look at somebody who did something slightly off. Renata was not looking at me at all, which is how I knew she was thinking about it. I did not laugh again for 2 days. I stopped drinking after 1. I got very careful about where my face was pointed, and I am 58 years old, and I had to remember how to do a thing I had not done since São Paulo. Now, the last night, we ate at the villa. The cook made a whole fish, and it was the best meal of the trip, and everybody was in a good mood, because it was the last night, and we were flying out at 11 the next morning. Renata was telling a story about a hotel in Oaxaca, in English, for Marisol's benefit, and it was a funny story, and she is a good storyteller. And she got stuck on a word. She was describing the courtyard, and she wanted a specific word. The tiled fountain in the middle, the kind with the raised basin, and she said, "Oh, what is it called, the water thing, in the middle, with the B." And I said, "Pila." I said it without looking up. I was cutting fish. I said it the way you say bless you when somebody sneezes. And then I said, in English, "And did they ever get the bags back or did you just lose them?" 4 seconds. I counted them. I have counted them a lot since. Tobias's fork was in the air. Bertel looked up from his plate for the first time in about 10 minutes. Renata was completely still, and I could see her face doing arithmetic. 3 weeks. The terrace, the pool, the bar, every conversation, all at once, in about 4 seconds. And Marisol, my daughter, who had been keeping my ridiculous little secret all week and thought it was a joke, Marisol laughed and said, "Oh my God, Dad," and that laugh saved it, because it made it small. Renata heard her future daughter-in-law laugh at her father, and everybody at that table needed it to be nothing, and a laugh gave them permission. Bertel said something about how you pick up words on a trip, and Renata said, "Oh, we have been teaching you," and she was smiling, and she said it a half-second too quickly. And Tobias said, "My grandmother used to say pila, that is such an old word." Then Renata said, in English, and I have the exact phrasing, because Sabine and I have said it to each other about 40 times since. She said, "You have a good ear, Calvin." And I said, "Everybody says that." And she went back to her story and got the bags back at the end of it, and everybody laughed. They talked themselves out of it in under 90 seconds. People do not believe that when I tell them. So here is why it worked. Nobody wants to find out they have been overheard for 8 days. Nobody. The mind will not go there voluntarily, because the cost is unbearable. It means rereading everything. It means the terrace and the pool and the bar. It means a total accounting. So it grabs the cheapest available explanation with both hands. He knows a word. He picked up a word. He has been in restaurants. They wanted it to be one word so badly that they built it for themselves in front of me, and I did not have to say anything at all. There was one more test, and it came in the van. The next morning, on the way to the airport, Renata was in the middle row with Tobias, and I was in front next to the driver. And she said to him, quietly, in Spanish, "Did you pack the charger?" That is all. 4 words about a charger. She was not asking about a charger. She was running a test, because she had spent a night not sleeping, and she needed to know. And I looked out the window at a Pemex station, and I did not move one muscle in my face. Tobias said, "Yeah, it is in the front pocket." And I heard Renata Hallstrom exhale. That exhale is the single most satisfying sound I have ever heard in my life, and I have not told anybody that until right now. She flew home believing she had checked. The first thing I did when we landed at Love Field was call a man named Deshaun Marbury. Deshaun was in my unit in the 90s, and he is a certified court interpreter and translator in Dallas County, and he runs a small agency with 4 people in it. I did not tell him what it was on that first call. I said I had audio, and it was personal, and I would pay the rush rate. He said, "Calvin, we have known each other since 1991. You do not have to say the rush rate to me." I said, "I do, because I need the invoice. I need there to be an invoice and a rate and a receipt, because somebody is going to ask one day whether this was a favor." There was a pause, and then Deshaun said, "Oh, it is that kind." I said, "I need something translated, and I need it certified, and I need it in 4 days." He said, "What is it?" And I said, "It is 9 minutes of audio, and you are going to want to sit down." He called me back 31 hours later, which was faster than he said, and he did not say hello. He said, "Calvin, who are these people?" I said, "My daughter's fiancé and his mother." There was a silence on that phone. And then Deshaun Marbury, who I have known since 1991 and who does not editorialize, said, "I have translated murder trials." He sent me the document the next day. 11 pages, transcript in Spanish on the left and English on the right, with a certification page, and his stamp, and his signature, and his license number. And that is the single most important decision I made in this entire thing, and anybody who is ever in a situation like this should hear it. I did not translate it myself. I could have. I am better than competent, and I could have had it done in 3 hours, and it would have been worth nothing. Because if I hand my daughter my own translation of a conversation about her, then it is a father's word against a fiancé's, and every single word of it becomes a thing she has to decide whether to believe about a man she loves. Instead, I handed her a stamped legal document produced by a stranger who does not know her name. That is not a father's opinion. That is an exhibit. There were 4 days between Deshaun's document arriving and my telling my daughter, and they were the worst 4 days of the whole thing, because she called me twice in those 4 days, about ordinary business, and I had to have both conversations. The second one was about a carrier contract in Memphis, and it went about 11 minutes, and she was sharp and funny, and at the end of it she said, "Oh, and Renata wants to talk about the cake people. Can you call her back? She has called me twice." And I said, "Sure." I hung up that phone and sat in my office with a certified translation in a drawer 18 inches from my hand, having just agreed to call a woman about a cake. I told her on a Thursday. Her mother and I did it together, at our kitchen table, at 8 in the evening, after I had asked her to come by, and she had asked why, and I had said, I would rather do it in person. I put the folder on the table, and I told her, from the beginning. The terrace on day 2, the decision not to tell her, the lie in the car about wanting to test my ear. I apologized for that lie first, before anything else, because it was the only thing I had done to her. Then I told her about the bar on day 4. And she said no. Just that. No. Not angry. Almost gentle. The way you correct somebody who has a fact wrong. She said, "Dad, you have got something wrong. That is not, no." I slid the folder across. And my daughter read 11 pages at her mother's kitchen table with the two of us sitting there. And I have never in my life had to sit through anything like it, and I hope I never do again. She read the first 3 pages fast. Then she went back and read them again slower. And she started building it. That is what people do, and it is not stupidity. It is love doing what love does. She said this could be about a different woman. Sabine said, Marisol. She said, no, listen. She says she does not say Marisol. This could be. And I said, page 6. Page 6 is where Renata says her name. Marisol stopped talking. She got to page 8, which is the pregnancy, and she put her hand flat on the table. And she read it twice. I watched her eyes go back up to the top of that section and go through it again. And then she said, in a completely different voice, very small, she said, he said I want kids anyway. I said yes. She said, he said that like it made it fine. I said yes. And then my daughter, who has fired people and negotiated with carriers who would eat you alive, and who ran a division at 26, put her head down on her own mother's kitchen table and cried like she was 9 years old. That is what those people did. That is what those people did, and anybody who thinks this was about money was not in that kitchen. She stayed at our house that night. She slept in her old room, which has not been her room since 2013, and which my wife has never entirely converted into anything else, and she did not have anything with her, so she wore a shirt of mine. At about 11, she came out and stood in the doorway of the kitchen and said, I have to tell you something, and you are going to be angry. I said, I doubt it. And she said, I already texted him. I said, what did you say? She said, I asked him if it was true. I said, and Marisol said, he said we need to talk in person. Not no, not what are you talking about. Not one word of confusion from a man being accused of something out of nowhere by the woman he is marrying in 5 months. We need to talk in person. She said, that is the answer, right? That is the whole answer. And I said, yes, that is the whole answer. At about 1 in the morning, she came downstairs where I was sitting in the dark, not doing anything. And she sat down and she said, Dad, what did they mean about shares? And I said, that is the other thing. The discrepancy had been sitting in my company since the previous fall, and nobody could find it. This is the part where a family matter turned into a criminal one. Our margins in the specialty containment line had been about 1.5 points off since roughly October. That is not a crisis. On $61 million, 1.5 points in one line is the kind of thing you notice and assign to somebody, and it goes on a list. Priscilla Diemi flagged it in January. Our controller looked at it twice and came back with volume mix, which is the answer you get when nobody has found anything. Marisol had it on her list. It was item 4 or 5 on a list of 11, and it had been there for months. The morning after that kitchen table, I called Purcell at 6:30 in the morning, and I said, pull every purchase order in vendor relations for the last 18 months, and do not tell anybody you are doing it, including Marisol, and I will explain why on Monday. He said, Calvin, what is going on? I said, I need you to trust me for 4 days. Here is what was in there. There is a company called Corvallis Container Services, registered in Texas in May of last year. May of last year. Tobias Hallstrom started in vendor relations in June of last year. Corvallis had invoiced Rutherford Freight Solutions 211 times in 14 months. Every single invoice was under $25,000. $25,000 is our threshold. Below it, a vendor relations manager can approve a purchase order on his own signature. Above it, it requires a second authorization from finance and it goes into a different review queue. 211 invoices, not one of them above the line. The largest was $24,800. Total, $341,000. The registered agent of Corvallis Container Services is a man named Aurelio Sandoval. Aurelio Sandoval is Renata Hallstrom's younger brother. He lives in Katy, Texas, and he sells commercial flooring. Corvallis did deliver product. That is the part that made it invisible for 14 months. It was a real shell in the sense that boxes arrived. They bought crating from an actual supplier in Houston at market and resold it to us at somewhere between 40 and 60% over. Real goods, real deliveries, real invoices, real signatures. That is why it survived 2 look-ins from a controller. Nothing was missing. Everything was just slightly expensive, in a category where prices move, spread over 211 transactions. The signature on all 211 purchase orders is Tobias Hallstrom's. Not forged, not stolen, his own name, on a form he was authorized to sign, On a job my daughter asked me to give him, and I gave him in about 90 seconds. That is the piece I have to carry. Nobody put that man in my company. I did. Purcell Adeyemi has worked for me for 19 years. He started as a dispatcher in Garland in 2006, and he runs $111 million of freight now, and he is the second most careful person I have ever met. He did not ask me why on that phone call at 6:30 in the morning. He said okay and hung up, and then he did not sleep properly for 4 days. What he did was pull every purchase order in that department for 18 months and put them in a spreadsheet by vendor, which is about 1,100 lines, and then sort by frequency. Corvallis was not the largest vendor by dollars, it was ninth. It was first by count. That is the thing that jumped out at a man who has been looking at freight documents since 2006. Not the money, the rhythm. 211 invoices from a vendor nobody in the building had ever met, at a cadence of about 3 a week, none of them ever crossing a line. He told me later he knew in about 20 minutes, and spent the next 3 days making sure, because he was not going to bring me something on a Sunday that was not airtight. Purcell brought me the file on a Sunday afternoon, and he had been up most of 2 nights, and he put it on my kitchen table, and he did not say anything for a second. Then he said, "Calvin, who is Aurelio Sandoval?" And I said, "He is the brother-in-law of a woman who told her son to get my daughter pregnant so she would lose interest in this company." Purcell Adeyemi sat down in a chair in my kitchen. We took it to a lawyer on Monday, then to a forensic accounting firm on Wednesday. Then, 11 days later, to the Dallas County District Attorney's Office, and after that to the FBI, because the invoices moved by wire, and the shell was set up across a state line for the Houston supplier, and once you are moving money by wire, in a scheme, it stops being a Texas problem. I did not do any of that fast. That is the thing people get wrong about this part. It took 19 days from Purcell's file to a meeting with an assistant district attorney, and in those 19 days Tobias Hallstrom came to work every single day, and I saw him twice in a hallway and said good morning to him both times. The second time he asked me how my golf game was. I do not play golf. He was making conversation with his fiancé's father in a hallway on a Tuesday, and I said, "Terrible," and we both laughed, and I went into my office and sat down. The board meeting was on a Thursday in June. Who was in that room matters more than what I said in it. Our board is 5 people. Me, Marisol, and 3 outside directors. A retired carrier executive named Wilhelmina Oduya, a private equity man named Ford Tesaro, and a lawyer named Gaspar Baudry. Also in that room, Purcell, our general counsel, 2 people from the forensic accounting firm, and a woman from the district attorney's office, who was there to observe, and who I had been told to introduce as counsel, and not by her title. And Tobias. Tobias was in that room because Marisol had asked him to be, 4 days earlier, by email, and she had told him it was about a possible expansion of his role. That was her idea, not mine. My daughter wrote that email herself. I told her she did not have to be in that room at all, and she looked at me like I had lost my mind. He came in a suit. He came in a suit and he had a folder with him and he had prepared something, because he thought he was being made an officer of the company, and he shook Ford Tesaro's hand on the way in and asked him about his flight. Wilhelmina Oduya later told me it was the worst thing she has ever watched happen to a person, and that she does not want to be in a room like that again. I opened the meeting, and I opened it in Spanish. Not for effect. That is a lie. It was entirely for effect, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But it was also the only accurate way to start, because the whole thing began in that language, and I was not going to let one word of what came next happen in translation. I said, in Spanish, "Good morning. Before we begin, I want to say something in the language in which most of this actually happened." Nobody in that room spoke Spanish except Marisol, who is functional, and Tobias, who is native. So for about 11 seconds, 3 outside directors and 2 accountants and a woman from the district attorney's office watched a 58-year-old man speak a language they did not understand, and watched one man at the end of the table go the color of the wall behind him. Ford Tesaro said, "Calvin, I do not follow." And I said, in English, "No, but he does." Then I turned to Tobias and I said, in Spanish, and this is on a transcript because our board meetings are recorded, and I knew that when I did it, I said, "I heard everything. In Cabo, every day, all of it." And Tobias Hallstrom said, out loud, in Spanish, before he could stop himself, he said, "No puede ser. That cannot be." That is the only thing he said in that meeting that was true. I switched to English and I did not go back. I laid it out for the board in about 19 minutes, and I did it flat, the way you present anything to a board, because the material did not need help. Corvallis. The registration date, the threshold, 211 invoices, $341,000. The registered agent and his relationship to the family of the man sitting at the end of the table. Then the forensic accountants took 11 minutes. Tobias tried twice. The first time he said, Marisol, and she did not look at him. The second time he stood up and said it was a legitimate vendor, and there was a competitive process, and Aurelio had disclosed the relationship. And Gaspar Baudry, who is 71 and has been on boards for 30 years, said, disclosed to whom, and where is that document? And Tobias Hallstrom stood in the middle of a boardroom in a suit with a folder in his hand and did not have anything. Then Marisol spoke. She had not said one word for 31 minutes. She said Tobias. He said Mari, please. And she said, on the fourth day, at the bar, your mother told you to get me pregnant so I would lose interest in my job. The forensic accountants looked at their laptops. The woman from the district attorney's office wrote something down. And Marisol said, and you said, she wants kids anyway. Tobias said, that is not, she does not, you do not know how my mother. And my daughter said, I have 11 pages. Certified it has your name in it, in her voice. Then she said the last thing she has ever said to that man, and I have never been prouder of anybody in my life. She said, I did not need you to defend me from her. I needed you to not agree. Before that, though, there was one more thing, and it is the only moment in that room I did not plan and could not have. After Marisol said what she said, Tobias turned to me. Not to her, to me. And he said, Calvin. That is all he got out. He said my name, and it came out the way it had come out in my kitchen in April of last year when he asked me for permission to marry my daughter, and I heard it, and my whole chest went sideways for about a second and a half. Because he meant it. That is the thing I cannot get around and have stopped trying to. Some real part of that man liked me, and was, in that room, in a suit, at the end of his life as he had understood it, reaching for the person in the room who had been kind to him. And I did not say anything. I looked at him for about 3 seconds, and then I looked at Gaspar Baudry and said, is there anything further from the board? That is the cruelest thing I have ever done to another human being, and I would do it again, and I still think about it. He was walked out by 2 people from our security contractor at 11:40 in the morning, and his laptop and his phone and his badge went into an evidence bag on a table in a conference room, and he did not say anything on the way out. Tobias called Marisol 11 times that afternoon, and she did not answer any of them. The 11th one he left a voicemail, and she played it for me in my office 2 days later, with the phone face up on my desk between us. It is 4 minutes long. The first 90 seconds is an apology, and it is a good one. It is specific, and it does not make excuses. And at one point, his voice goes. Then at about the 2-minute mark, it turns. And it turns the way these things always turn, which is that he starts explaining his mother. What she is like, what she was like when he was a kid, how you do not say no to her, and she does not mean things the way they sound. And the last 40 seconds he asks her whether there is any way to keep the criminal side of it out of it. Whether Calvin would consider handling it internally. Whether Calvin would consider... My daughter listened to that whole thing, sitting in a chair in my office. And at the end of it, she picked up the phone and blocked the number and put it face down and said, okay. Renata Hallstrom called my house at 4 that afternoon. She called our landline, which almost nobody has. And Sabine picked it up, which was not planned, and which was the single luckiest thing that happened in this whole affair. Renata said, Sabine, thank God, there has been the most enormous misunderstanding Calvin has. And my wife said, in Spanish, Nosotras te oímos. We heard you. Nosotras, the feminine plural. Not we as in the family, we as in the women. Sabine Rutherford, who has functional Spanish and who lay in a chair on day 7 with her eyes closed while a woman said that her daughter is not, and stopped, told that woman in her own language that she had been heard, and then hung up the telephone. She did not tell me she had done it for 2 days. Tobias Hallstrom was indicted in September. Wire fraud, 11 counts. In federal court, a scheme like that gets charged per wire, which is why the number is 11 and not 1. And that is a thing most people do not know, until it happens near them. He pleaded in the spring rather than go to trial, because there is no defense to 211 purchase orders with your own signature on them going to your uncle's company. 41 months. Restitution of $341,000, which he does not have and which will follow him for the rest of his working life. Aurelio Sandoval pleaded as well. 18 months. He is 61 years old, and he sold commercial flooring in Katy, Texas, and his sister asked him to register a company. There is one more thing about Bertil Hallstrom. He came to see me in August, by himself. He drove from Houston, and he did not call ahead, which is a thing I would normally have something to say about, and I did not. He sat in my kitchen, and he was there about 40 minutes, and he was mostly quiet. At one point he said, "I did not know about the company," and I believe him about that, and I told him so. Then he said, "I knew about the other." He did not elaborate, and I did not ask him to, and I have decided he meant everything, from the room assignments to these people, to a sentence about my daughter that his wife did not finish on day 7. He said, "I have been sitting at that table for 35 years. Then he said, "Thank you for the trip," and he stood up and shook my hand and drove back to Houston. That is the only apology anybody in that family has produced, and it came from the man who never said one word in Spanish that I heard. Renata Hallstrom was not charged. That is the thing that sits in me at 4 in the morning, and I am not going to pretend I have made peace with it. She never signed anything. Her name is on no document connected to Corvallis Container Services. She did not send an email. She did not sign an invoice or a registration or a bank card. Everything she did out loud, in Spanish, in rooms she believed were private. The assistant district attorney explained it to me in a conference room, patiently, and she was right about every word of it. A recording made in Mexico by a private citizen who was a participant in the setting. A conspiracy theory of the case that would require proving what a woman intended from 9 minutes of poolside conversation. A defense attorney who would spend 3 days on my Spanish. She said, "Mr. Rutherford, I could charge her. I do not believe I could convict her, and if I lose that case, everything you have here gets a great deal harder." And I said, "Then do not charge her." That was my decision. I made it in about 4 seconds, and I have gone back over it about 400 times, and I would make it again, because Tobias Hallstrom is in federal custody, and if I had reached for his mother, he might not be. She got away with it. That is the truth, and I am not going to give you a better ending than the one that happened. Except, Renata Hallstrom did not get away with it, and I understood that in November, and it took me until November to see it. Her son is a felon. Her brother is a felon, Aurelio Sandoval, who did what his big sister asked him to do, the way he probably has since 1971. Bertil Hallstrom filed for divorce in October. I did not know that was coming, and I have thought about that man a great deal. He sat at a table on day 5 and did not answer his wife when she said "these people," and he looked at his plate, and I have decided that silence was not agreement. I have decided it was a man who had been sitting at that table for 35 years and had run out of ways to say anything. I have no way to know if that is true. I hope it is. That woman is 59 years old and she has no husband, a son in a federal facility, a brother who will not take her calls, and a story in Houston that has moved through every circle she has, because those things move. She did all of that herself with her mouth, at a swim-up bar, 11 feet from a man she had decided was furniture. There is no charge for that. There did not need to be one. We told the company on a Monday. 190 people, most of them in Garland, some on a video link from Memphis and Atlanta, and Marisol did it herself and would not let me do it. She stood up in a warehouse in front of 190 people, at 31 years old, and said that the man they had all met at the Christmas party, who some of them had worked with every day for 14 months, had been indicted for stealing from them, and that she had been engaged to him, and that she was the one who had asked for him to be hired. She said that last part. Nobody made her say it, and I would have told her not to. There was a woman on our dock named Tamsin Reyes who has been there 11 years and who came up to Marisol afterward and did not say anything at all, and just put a hand on her arm for a second and walked off. Marisol told me later that was the only part of that day she could not get through without going somewhere private. Marisol has run that company for the last 14 months, and she has had the best 2 quarters in our history. She is not fine. She is functioning at an extremely high level, and she is not fine, and those are 2 different things, and I have watched enough people confuse them. She was in that boardroom because she chose to be, and she said the exact right thing at the exact right time, and then she went home and did not come in for 2 days. She is seeing somebody, professionally, and she told me that herself, and did not seem to think it needed explaining, which is a generational thing I admire. She has not dated anybody, and she has said she is not going to for a while. And the thing she said to me in October, which I was not ready for, was this. She said, "Dad, I keep thinking about the fact that I asked you to hire him." I said, "Marisol." And she said, "No, I asked you. And you said yes in about a minute because I asked, and that is how he got a signature authority." And I said, "I am the one who put him in a job with a threshold. You asked me for a favor for somebody you loved. I am the one who ran that company for 26 years and knew exactly what that job could do." She said, "We are going to argue about this for the rest of our lives." I said, "Probably." We closed the threshold, by the way, first thing we did. There is no purchase order in that company at any dollar amount that gets one signature now. 211 invoices under a line that I set myself in 2009 and never looked at again. We got about $140,000 back from the wedding. The venue kept the deposit, which was fair. The band out of Chicago kept theirs. The florist in Ecuador had not shipped yet. I did not fight any of it. I paid what I owed, and I walked away from the rest. And there was one invoice I paid in full that I did not have to. The local grower Marisol had picked originally, before Renata called her rustic. A woman with 11 greenhouses outside Dripping Springs. She had already started growing for October. Nobody had told her anything. I sent her the full amount, and a note that said the wedding is not happening, and this is not your fault, and I am sorry. She sent back a card. She wrote, "Thank you, and I hope your daughter is all right." That card is on my desk. I have a stamped 11-page certified translation in a fireproof box in my office, and a card from a woman I have never met on my desk, and I could not tell you exactly why, except that one of them is what people are actually like. Here is what I would leave you with. For 26 years, I built a company on the idea that I could read people. That was my actual skill, not logistics. I have people who understand logistics better than I ever did. What I had was 6 years of sitting in rooms as the interpreter watching men reveal themselves, and I came out of that job believing there was almost nothing I could not see coming. And a woman sat in my kitchen in January of 2023 and asked me whether I built this house or bought it, and I answered the question. I have gone back through every single interaction I had with Renata Hallstrom over 2.5 years, and there is not one thing she said to my face that I could have taken to anybody. Not one. She was warm to me for 30 months. The entire content of that woman was in a language she chose specifically because she thought it was a locked room. And here is the part that I want anybody listening to actually take with them, because it is not about Spanish. Everybody has a locked room. It is not always a language. Sometimes it is a group chat. Sometimes it is a car ride. Sometimes it is a phone call in a driveway when they think you are asleep. And the thing people believe about the locked room is that it does not count. That the real them is the one at the table being pleasant, and the locked room is just letting off steam. It is the exact opposite. The locked room is the whole person. The table is the performance. I got very lucky. I got lucky because a woman in Cleveland named Ondina Fuentes fed a boy rice in 1981 and did not mind the questions, and because a piece of luggage came out late in an airport in Cabo San Lucas, and because my daughter got distracted before she could say something completely innocent at a dinner. That is the entire margin. That is all that stood between my daughter and a marriage designed as an acquisition. I would not have found it any other way. There was no version of me spotting this from the outside. He had a clean signature authority, and a real vendor, and a plausible margin variance in a category where prices move. I found it because I heard a woman say the word shares through a refrigerator. One more thing before that. Marisol asked me in December whether I regretted the vacation. She meant it kindly. She meant, "Do you wish you had never spent that money on those people?" And I told her the truth, which is that it is the best $111,000 I have ever spent in my life. Because there is a version of all of this where I did not book that trip. In that version, they get married in October. He stays in vendor relations and the invoices keep coming at 3 a week. And in 18 months, it is 700,000 instead of 341. And by then there is a baby. And by then Marisol has moved to 4 days. And by then, Renata Hallstrom has spent 2 years being the most helpful grandmother in Texas. And at some point in that version, somebody finds the invoices anyway, because somebody always does. And in that version, my daughter is 34 with a child and a husband under federal indictment, and a company she has stepped back from. And every single option in front of her is worse than the one she had at that kitchen table. I bought 8 days at a swim-up bar for $111,000. It was cheap. So the last thing, when somebody thinks you cannot understand them, they are not hiding from you, they are showing you. Stand still and let them finish. If you got something out of this one, subscribe before you go. That is the one that actually matters. I put a new story up every single day, and the next one is already written. Hit like on the way out. It genuinely helps this reach the people it is for. And in the comments, tell me the honest thing, not the kind one. His mother never signed a single document, and she is not going to be charged with anything. Did she get away with it? I read every single one of them. I will see you in the next one.